very top where it says sharing screen. Does your bar? Oh yeah, there you go.
Got it. Thanks. All right, let's get started then. Well, thanks everyone for your patience and for joining us this morning. Before we get to today's presentation, we're going to jump right into the heart of today's convening and try to get your creative juices flowing. So I would like to invite you to study the image on your screen for just a moment and take a guess as to what you think this graph might represent. When you're ready, go ahead and either enter your guess into the chat box or feel free, since we're a small group today, you might as well unmute and shout it out. Don't be shy. And I'll give you a hint, it obviously has to do with the topic of today's session.
Jenny, I don't know if you can see the chat, but we've got some responses in the chat.
Yeah, I did just see it. It was blinking at me. All right, so anything related to money, income gap, housing insecurity, all on close. Anything else? Any last guesses? Again, feel free to unmute or chat. All right, well, the big reveal here. The graph depicts the gap in median wealth between white and Black households since the 1960s. So what does this tell us? It tells us that since, in the 70 years since the landmark civil rights legislation was enacted, including the Fair Housing Act, seemingly no progress has been made in reducing wealth inequalities between Black and white households. As this graph notes, by 2016, the year for which the most recent data was available, excuse me, Black families' median wealth, household wealth was just 8.7% of the median wealth of white households. So put another way, when you combine the median net worth, you would have to combine that as 11.5 Black households median net worth to equal just 1 white households. Pretty remarkable. So I wonder if we might just take 1 minute more, if you'll humor me for another minute as we, again, get some more folks in the room to think about what policies or practices or systems might help to explain the persistence in this gap. Again, feel free to enter your answers in the chat box or unmute. Housing policies, redlining, good guesses. Remember, yes, a good hint would be we learned a lot about this in the first session back in October. Any other guesses? Maybe historical perspectives or maybe current policies and practices? Lending policies. Biases from realtors, lack of access to banking. Yeah, all really good. Good guesses, that is, not good practices, I should say. Well, thank you for humoring me, and also for sort of, not only just showing up today, but demonstrating your willingness to engage and to really dive into today's topic. So there will be more opportunities for conversation during our time together. And if you're so inclined, we invite you to turn on your camera so that we can see who we're chatting with, and also change your name to include your title and your state by clicking on the 3 small dots next to your image. We are here today for the 3rd installment of our 5-part series on early childhood development and well-being through the race equity lens. Many of you on the line today were with us in previous sessions and will recall that in September, we learned about the historical context for racial inequities and disparities that continue to affect families of color and children of color today. Dr. Allen reminded us that race is a social construct, a classification of human beings that is politically defined. And then in November, we applied this legacy as well as current discriminatory policies and practices that persist today and result in health inequities for Black families and children. We took a deep dive into maternal mortality and health, more specifically, and some state policies. So you can find recordings of those 2 sessions, as well as slide decks, resources, and some recaps posted on our website, linked here. Allison's also going to link to it in the chat box. Today, we're going to turn our attention to how race, housing, and economic opportunity are intertwined and how they affect early childhood. So we have 2 hours set up for today's call. We're aiming for closer to an hour and a half, maybe less. We, of course, want to be sure there's plenty of time for dialogue and to get to your questions. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Camille Bousset with us from the Brookings Institution. Camille is a senior fellow and director of Brookings Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative, which is a cross-program initiative focused on issues of equity, racial justice, economic mobility for low-income communities and communities of color. You can read more about Camille's accolades and breadth of expertise at the link Allison is dropping in the chat. Camille will lead us through a deeper conversation of the reasons for the wealth gap that we began to talk about at the top of the hour. She will tell us about current policies and practices affecting Black families' ability to secure well-paying jobs, buy homes, and accumulate wealth. And we'll also get into the effect COVID has had on Black families' financial security. Then we'll spend a little bit of time in conversation, connecting what we've learned from Camille with what we know about early childhood development and learning. And then we will hear from my colleague, Shannon, who is a research analyst here on our Children and Families team. She works on an array of policy domains affecting children and families' well-being, including housing and homelessness. Shannon will share some trends, some legislative examples related to reducing racial disparities in access to quality housing. So if at any time you have a question for Camille or Shannon, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute your line. With that, I will hand things over to Camille.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say how happy I am to be here. I'm always very interested in the work that NCSL does. And I know that being an early childhood fellow here is a special honor. So I just wanted to thank you very much for joining all of us as we have this discussion. So what I will say, I'm going to start with a bit of a slide deck, but what I wanted to say is I'd really welcome your turning on your cameras, and I'd welcome your interaction as I go through the slide deck. I feel it's really important to get pretty interactive fairly quickly, and so don't hesitate to interrupt me or to to ask a question or to contribute a comment as we go along. And as Jennifer mentioned, I will present for about 15-20 minutes, which I hope will be very much an interactive discussion. And then we'll move on to Shannon. But I just want to assure you that I really hope that this is kind of a learning environment and that, you'll feel free to, this is kind of cone of silence. The comments you make here stay here, and just to feel, comfortable with sharing your reactions. And with that, I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Can everybody see? Can everybody see this? Yep. Okay, great. So what I wanted to talk about today is, obviously we're going to be talking about housing policy, but I just wanted to say, okay, why do we really care about housing policy? There are many, many reasons to care about it, but I sort of wanted to kind of walk you through a framework so you understand why it is we care about this and why we might be thinking about policies that we can, or policy proposals that we could think about as we move through the next few years. particularly at the state level. So you have clearly, based on the poll and obviously the previous seminars, you have, obviously are exposed to the concept of redlining. I think everybody is pretty, understands that concept and the history behind that. That's our red circle here. So discriminatory housing policies, it's mostly redlining, but there are other kinds of discriminatory housing policies. As we all know, they're illegal, but discriminating on the basis of race is still a practice that happens and does have impact on a number of families and communities. If we build out from there, so once you have the I would say the rubric and the consensus around discriminatory housing policies that you had in the 1930s in this country, there was also an effort to create a built environment which discriminated against racial minorities. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Discriminating, once you have a sort of a built environment and housing policies that are discriminatory in the context of a country that allows school districts to be very localized and the control around education to be very localized, we also have what I'm going to be calling aggressive disinvestment in Black and Brown students. So we'll talk about that. And then we also have, as a result of all of these things, the red, orange, and yellow circles, we also have what is what I'm going to call closed social networks. And social networks are very important to how people get jobs, access opportunities, both employment opportunities, educational opportunities, and housing opportunities. So you need to know people who know about those things. You need to have an open flow of information to understand what's available to you. And it turns out that in places where you have, particularly in places where you have discriminatory housing policies, you also have very closed social networks. And then we're going to talk a little bit about policies that support racial wealth and health gaps. And the reason I want to talk about that is I also want us to shine a rather bright light on some of the things that we don't typically think about when we think about discriminatory housing policies and the racial wealth gap. So that's our, that is going to be our framework. And I'm going to go from there to our first slide. So just a review, probably, I'm hoping at this point, but probably worth looking at. So if we look at, so here we're going to be talking about discriminatory housing policies, and in particular redlining. And if you look at the map on the left-hand side, this is the 1937 map of Baltimore, which was used by real estate folks to indicate areas that were desirable and then weren't desirable. And just to be very clear here, so there's a legend that says food deserts, which is in red, and the places that are red and kind of magenta are places that were considered lower real estate or undesirable real estate tracts. If you look on the right-hand side, this is a 2016 US Census Bureau map. Heat map. And this is poverty concentration in Baltimore. So it's the same Baltimore. The darker the color, the greater the poverty concentration. And as you can see, the maps are not exact, but they're fairly close. So there's obviously been a carryover from the redlining of the 1930s to what we see in this era in terms of poverty concentration. Then if you, we're going to look at that map again. Again, we've got the same redlining map on the left. On the right, we now have the concentration of the African-American population. And as you see, the concentration of the African-American population is not that dissimilar from the concentration of poverty in that we saw in the previous heat map from the Census Bureau from 2016, and again mirrors very much what we see from the 1937 real estate redlining map. So what I want to say about that is that we think of 1937 as a really long time ago, and there have been a number of legislative and juridical sort of advances to remove redlining and to increase access to housing and to make that fair, particularly in the lending area, but also just in terms of access to adequate housing. But what you can see is that the legacy of redlining in terms of where people are and how that may have affected their status, socioeconomic status, is quite lasting. So if we had pulled the maps from like 2018 or 2019, you would see something very similar. I didn't pull anything from 2020 because 2020 has been a weird year, but this just gives you a sense of how lasting this is. This is several generations later, and we're still seeing the same kinds of patterns. So I know that as you've been going through this program, you've been introduced to a young man named Jamal. And I know Jamal is 5 years old. And imagine Jamal living in one of these areas in Baltimore that with very, very heavy concentration of African Americans, which also happens to be, and I'm just going to go back, areas of very high poverty concentration. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that Jamal probably is living in a place which is not particularly desirable. It probably means, given the fact that the way we have school jurisdictions set up, that Jamal is probably not going to an amazing school. And it might mean that Jamal's parents either are, well, they probably don't have very much wealth, and their lack of wealth might show up in the amount of food Jamal has to eat, might show up in the kinds of extracurricular activities that he is not participating in. Their lack of wealth might also show up in the number of people that Jamal's parents have to support, which is probably not just Jamal, but it's probably some brothers and sisters of his parents, some aunties and uncles of Jamal, probably grandparents as well. Okay. So, because when you have low wealth communities, everybody is pitching in to help everybody else. So let's just think about that for a second. All right, we're going to move on. So one of the interesting things about discriminatory housing policies in the 1930s is that sort of set the framework for discrimination in a range of other kinds of policies. And I'm going to really stay very focused right now on the built environment. This is a photograph of the South Parkway in New York. And what we're seeing here, so Robert Moses was a big city planner in New York. And what we're seeing here is the construction of a bridge. It's part of linking a park to a neighborhood. And it's called a parkway. And that bridge, which looks really nice, right? It's got like the brick and it looks pretty cool, actually, architecturally, is actually too low to allow buses through. And you also can't get trucks through there. The idea was that there would be no sort of large, large vehicle transport in and out past this neighborhood. It would just be for cars. But when you look through the notes and the intentions that Robert Moses had, he knew very well that by lowering the clearance on these kinds of bridges, and they're all over New York, you also prevented people from going into those higher income neighborhoods via buses, right? And so what he did is, in addition to establishing an elaborate set of roadways and parkways, bridges, et cetera, that he's well known for in New York, he also established the ways in which the built environment could discriminate against egress and access to opportunity in New York City. And so he took the template and the thinking behind redlining, and he created those kinds of barriers. So let's think about Jamal, right? So you are living now in a place like Baltimore or any other place. Think about all the places in your respective states where there's a high concentration of poverty. And I bet when you think about that, you'll know there's a railroad track going kind of, cordoning off that community, or a set of highways, and that community is kind of caught in that set of highways. A number of other ways that really demarcate lower income, poorer communities. So imagine living in a place like that, and it's hard to get buses in and out of the center of commercial activity. Or if you want to get a bus and buses in and out, it's kind of a bus and then a train and then something else. And it's like 3 or 4 things. And 2.5 hours later, you arrive. And then, so think about that and how hard that is to access opportunity, and how hard it might be for Jamal's parents who want to do, care for Jamal, right? They have, like any other parents, have a whole host of other things to do, but they need to spend something like 2.5 hours going in and 2.5 hours going out to get to a job that probably isn't paying them very well. And so you also think about if they have a car, right? If they do have a car and they have access in and out, think about, their ability to maintain that car, make sure that that car is available to take Jamal various places, et cetera. And that then makes us focus on what kind of income do they have coming in, right? So let's think a little bit about that. So income in general in the United States tends to be increasingly linked to your educational status and your educational achievement. And so what I want to talk about here, I'm just going to give you a snapshot of some work that I've been doing in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Charlotte, North Carolina is not unusual in the following sense. So places where schools where Black students tend to predominate tend to have much lower language arts and math achievement than places where white students dominate. That's true in Charlotte, and it's true in a number of other cities that I've studied. But in addition to that, you have what we're now calling school climate. This is the new term of art. And basically what it means is, the sort of context of school suspensions and discipline in a particular school district. So if you look at this particular chart that I have here, what you're looking at on the left-hand side, on the y-axis is short-term suspension count, and then you're looking across on the x-axis by school year. And at the very top, we have a legend that shows this is public schools in North Carolina. And so what you're going to see at the top, or the legend is, the green is for male multiracial, the the blue is for male white, the yellow is for male Black, the gray is for male Hispanic, and the orange is for male Asian. And I think probably the most important thing to note about this is that Black boys are suspended at an astronomically higher rate than white boys. White boys are blue, Black boys are yellow. Okay, so when you see something like that, a couple things come to mind. First of all, it's very hard for students to do well. Like, so if Jamal is in this category, it's very hard to do well when you've been pulled out, a number of times. So it's like in the year, let's say 2012, you had something like 20,000 suspensions for Black boys. It's a lot, right? So pulled out of school, so your likelihood of achieving is going to be extremely low, and you're already in a school that isn't serving you well, right? So this kind, and you can see this has happened over a number of years. We're looking at a 10-year period. There's been an aggressive disinvestment in Black boys in particular. And what's so interesting about that is that once you get lower achievement and higher suspension rates, a couple things happen. It's hard for you to graduate from high school, and it's also hard for you to be competitive for college if you wanted to go on to college, which then limits your opportunities to have a job if you're going that route. But also high suspension rates typically mean some interaction with law enforcement. And when you have interaction with law enforcement, that also limits your opportunities to gain employment. And the bigger picture of this comes out in a study that was done about 4 years ago by Raj Chetty and a team at Harvard, which showed that if you were to change the trajectory of Black boys and Black men in America, if you could just change their trajectories, you could solve the racial wealth gap problem. The problem we're seeing here, right, comes out of historical housing discrimination, built environment discrimination that has set the stage for complacency around lower serving schools that poorly serve Blacks and particularly Black boys, and that aggressively disinvest in them by pulling them out on a regular basis out of the normal school cycle. So if you're Jamal, your father was probably affected by this. And if you're Jamal, this is likely to be your future, which is going to make it very hard for you to earn income and to provide for your family as you go forward. Let's move.
Can I just, can I share something real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for that. We're going to spend some time in our next session talking about suspension expulsion specifically for preschoolers, where we know the same discrepancy exists. But I really appreciate you connecting it to the topic of today, as well as far as future income and neighborhoods. I also just wanted to share that Assemblywoman Solage from New York pointed out when you were sharing the picture of the bridge that she still has several of these bridges in the district that she represents. So I thought that was, as we might think that this was from, I think the 30s you said, but they in a lot of ways are still having an impact.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much, Assemblywoman Solage, for pointing that out. And I'm sure if we all think about it in our own neighborhoods, we know places like that. And then I'm going to just, yeah, sorry.
Questions till the end. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning.
No, we can have questions right now.
Okay. Do you know what happened in 2013 we've had this issue in my district with that gap of students being suspended and the problems that has led to with education. What happened in 2013 to change that a little bit, where you see all those numbers drop? Was a program started, or was attention brought to the area, or what?
So starting in 2012, there was more attention given at the federal level to school climate and to making sure that school districts actually collected that information and reflected on it and reported on it to the federal level. And so that forced a lot of school districts to really think about, what's really happening here, and often to create some programs to kind of drive those rates down. But the key is the rates have gone down, but the disproportionality of it still remains, and that's still a very deep concern. So I think some advances, as you're pointing out, but clearly not where things need to be. And the interesting thing, just to kind of elaborate a little bit about that, is that these school suspensions, although you guys are going to hear about school suspensions at the preschool level, and that is a real thing, most of these school suspensions happen between 6th and 11th grade. So this is during adolescence, and it's when kids are forming identities of who they are. So think about the education, the school environment is supposed to be very supportive. And this is a point when you're particularly vulnerable as an adolescent, and the school environment is not supportive. It's in fact telling you that we don't really want you to be here. And that is the moment at which people, young people develop their identities, or developing their identities. They're also developing their friendships and their relationships. And it's pulling them out at a very important developmental stage, which has a tremendous amount of, it has really negative impacts, both psychologically, also in terms of their development, economically, in terms of their ability to have lasting social relationships that will be important to accessing opportunities later, and something I will talk about. One of the things I wanted to spend some time on is some research that I did, and I don't have a slide about this, and it segues into your question. So research I did was basically trying to figure out how people's social networks were linked to job and housing and education opportunities. And we focused on those because those are the answers. If you have a good job, you're in a nice neighborhood or a comfortable neighborhood, and you have access to educational opportunities, you also have access to higher streams of income and economic mobility more generally. So we asked hundreds of people in 4 different cities: Charlotte, Racine, Wisconsin, San Francisco, California, and Washington, DC. And we asked them who they went to when they wanted to get a job, look for a housing opportunity or educational opportunity. And then we asked them to describe those people, like, what were they like? Were they similar to you? Or are they not, et cetera? So we also wanted to know how strong those relationships were. What did they get from those relationships? Information, references, et cetera. And whether those relationships were reciprocal. So boiling it all down, after looking at basically something like 40,000 different personal networks, what we found was that these networks tend to be highly racialized. So mostly white people have mostly like 97 to 99% of their networks relative to jobs, housing, and education are white people. Blacks have mostly Blacks, but they have some others in there. And Latinos and Asians, Native Americans, they tended to have more heterogeneous networks. This is overall across all 4 cities. The other finding was that Black men have the smallest networks overall. And if we think back to Raj Chetty's observation that if you were to really focus on Black boys, you would eliminate the racial wealth gap. The fact that these Black men that were participated in our study across these 4 cities had very small networks relative to these opportunities tells us a lot about the kinds of aggressive disinvestment that we make in these boys/men throughout their lives, and why it is so difficult for us to close the racial wealth gap. So typically Black men had 1 or maybe 2 people in their network, whereas other people, white men, would typically have 5 or 6 people in their network that were central to everything that they did. And Black men had less reciprocal networks. And they tend to be removed from employment because they have a higher unemployment rate. They're removed from schools, as we've seen. They are underserved by schools, and people tend to form their social networks either K through 12 in college or in work, at the work setting. So when you don't have good social networks to access opportunities, you're going to have a really hard time. And this is probably true for Jamal's parents. So I wanted to just close by talking about policies that support the racial wealth and health gaps, and just kind of very quickly going over a couple of statistics that are relatively new. So this is from the most recent Federal Reserve and US Census Bureau surveys. So the home ownership gap we'll see here. So if we're looking at the graph on the left, the US Black home ownership rates remain below 45%, while whites approach 75%. So you'll see the non-Hispanic whites are the black line at the very top, and Blacks are the magenta line or the pink line. And one of the things you'll notice is that pink line actually is about as low now, today in 2020, is about as low as it was in 1994, meaning that any advances we made in access to home ownership have been destroyed basically by the 2010 recession, and have not really improved since then. So we're back to square one with home ownership, and home ownership is key to having wealth in the US. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but then I also wanted to just have you look at this financial disparity. So this is about assets, net worth. Whites are in purple. This is the graph on the right-hand side. Whites are in purple, the purple shaded area, and blacks are the kind of turquoise shaded area. You'll see there's just a tremendous gap. I don't think there's anything more to say about that, except that this is really, I mean, it's so huge that when you think about the kinds of policies that you'd have to do and undo it, it's undo this kind of thing, it's probably multifaceted. So one thing that I do want to talk about a little bit, particularly around the racial wealth gap, is how we think about credit scores. And this is just to give you some sense. So we think about credit scores as being able to reflect people's behavior, financial behavior. So the thinking behind it is everybody starts out equal. Some people do things that are consistent with what we consider ideal financial behavior, and other people don't, and the scores reflect that. I mean, that's the general thinking. But when you think about it, the credit scores actually reflect your ability to pay bills on time in the past. So it's always retrospective. And when you don't have enough income, for whatever reason, right, you're unlikely to be able to pay bills on time. When you don't have access to wealth, so housing, stocks, that type of thing, you hit a rough patch, you're probably not going to be able to pay bills on time. If you don't have wealth bequeathed to you, right, passed down to you, well, you're going to have to build that up yourself. And if you are in a position where, your income is not very high, your educational achievement is not very high, you may have had some brushes with the law very early on in your experience, your educational experience, very likely you're just not going to be able to pay bills on time. So what in fact you're seeing in credit scores is actually it just shows you the legacy of a whole host of policies that have discriminated against people of color and very poor and low income people of any color. In addition to that, the idea that everybody starts the same is, of course, flawed, because in this country, everybody does not start with the same level of wealth and ability to pay bills and income, et cetera. So at its very base, the credit score is pretty discriminatory, like just the assumptions behind that. And then think about how it's used. It's used to as a final background check for employment. It's used as a background check for access to housing, right? It's used often to when people are trying to get like a loan for a business, et cetera. So you think about that credit score and how it continues to replicate some of the racism that showed up in the 1930s. And I think that's just something for us to sort of think about as we move forward and think about proposals to address the racial wealth gap. The other thing I will just say is that low Black home ownership rates, very low net worth, are of course tied to, as we saw before, lower educational achievement and a range of other policies in the housing realm. One of the things that is an outcome of that is that Blacks in particular tend to be employed in these, what we now are calling essential jobs, but service sector jobs that really don't pay very well and don't, in general, have not provided a living wage. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 44 million low-income workers did not have access to benefits and were stringing together several jobs to be able to bring in enough income to stay afloat. So if you're a parent like Jamal's parents, you probably can't string together too many jobs because then you'll never be around for Jamal. So you will likely fall below what you can really manage, what you really need to be able to put food on the table, roof over your head, et cetera. And then you have to either take social services, social benefits, or you might have to think about moving from house to house, maybe living in a shelter, et cetera. So low income jobs without benefits and stringing those together does not equal a robust economy. And it puts families, particularly like Jamal's, in a very serious situation of financial fragility. There's something to think about there. My last slide, something that you guys already talked about, but I wanted to just spend a little time on this, is these are the impacts of COVID-19. This is actually the number of deaths per 100,000. And the main thing to think about here is we know Indigenous people are really at the top, followed by Black people, and then whites are much lower, Asians are even lower. So one of the things that happens when you have discriminatory housing policies that lead to a range of other discriminatory policies, particularly around income and wealth, is that people end up living in housing situations that force them together in smaller quarters and make it very difficult for them to socially distance and to be able to isolate if one of them is sick, right, during coronavirus. And so the level of, you can get a lot of the contagion, level of contagion can be much higher with that kind of density. That's number one. And then number two, a lot of the places that we saw, like in the Baltimore maps, that are considered low wealth, low value, like very high poverty areas, also are very underserved with respect to healthcare centers and healthcare establishments. They're also underserved with respect to grocery stores and places that could provide good food. And so all of that combines to make people very vulnerable. And so when we think about housing policy, it's not just a roof over people's heads. It's also about their entire well-being and the well-being of their children, like Jamal. And it's incumbent upon us to think about a range of policies that can help influence the ways in which a number of folks in these communities can actually have access to opportunities and can actually create the kind of escape velocity that we need to have in order to eliminate the racial wealth gap that we saw at the very beginning. So with that, I am going to stop and take questions.
Thank you so much, Camille. We did have one question come in while you were discussing the networks.
Sure.
And that was from Senator Petty from Kansas. Correct me if I get it wrong, but I think you were asking about, does the networking for, you were discussing finding work, does that extend to like family support networks, having someone to lean on when you as a parent need help?
Yeah, so great question. And so when we did this research, we asked about childcare, we asked about healthcare, we asked about COVID networks. So we have a lot of data. We've just reported out on the jobs, housing, and education, but we analyzed the childcare networks. And what we found is that those, again, tended to be, overall for everybody, they tended to be much smaller than, for instance, like a jobs network. But interestingly, they were incredibly tiny for people of color and lower income people. And they were almost 100% family, or some like close neighbor or something like that, but it was almost never like a nanny or somebody like that. And the ability of your family member or, close neighbor to provide childcare assistance was dependent upon their own job status and their own income status. So when the reason I think the question is so interesting is that when you have a high level of poverty in a neighborhood, everybody's affected by that and everybody's scrambling. And even though people are trying to support one another, it's all contingent on their own personal circumstances. So great question, and thank you for asking that.
What other questions do folks have for Camille? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute. Go ahead, Allison.
I don't know how to take my hand down now, but maybe it'll fall away. Camille, I'm just sort of curious, like what you just shared, I think is very interesting and not, something that I usually think much about in my sort of bubble of early care and education. But it's also a little, well, it is depressing and sad. So I'm just sort of curious, like, what can we do? What can policymakers do? Like, what are the easy next steps? Or, I mean, I think obviously change, moves glacially. And so we have to realize that, but what are just some, next best steps to sort of have the conversation or make sure other policymakers are aware, or, that kind of stuff?
So great question. There are a couple of things, and I see some Representative Barber also has a question. I'm going to actually answer both of those. So I think the first thing is to recognize how pervasive discrimination is in just about everything we do. I think that's kind of the first thing. And then the second thing is, when you think about what we can do, what we want to be able to do, where we want to go is we want everybody to be, to have access to the free flow of options, ideas, opportunities, right? And anything that is a barrier to that, whether it's physical or a convention or a set of policies or a set of laws or whatever, anything that is a roadblock to that free flow of information, resources, et cetera, is a problem and needs to be needs to be addressed. So let me just give you one little micro example, right? Which is that, you go to the grocery store, right? Like we all have that experience. Go to the grocery store. Who are the patrons of that grocery store, and who are the people who are actually working at that grocery store? If there's a big difference, right? That's something we need to think about. It's like an illustration of how opportunity sorts out. And so I think just having our eyes open, number one, like where all those problems and those disparities are, I think is very important. But I think the most important thing is, what can we do to remove barriers to the free flow of information, options, and opportunities? So one of the things I'm thinking about, when you're thinking about a Jamal, you want that Jamal to know that there are opportunities in neuroscience, and there are opportunities, to be a veterinarian, to be a poet, etc. But how is Jamal going to know about that? Like in other communities, well-to-do communities, I happen to live in one of those, the parents, the very, impressive and accomplished parents come in and talk about their jobs, right? Is that happening for Jamal? So I think that's the thing. What do we want? We want that free flow of options and opportunities. How do we get there? So a number of different ways. The other thing about credit reports, more specifically, is it's going to be very important to create policies that prevent employers and landlords from using credit scores to either provide, in the case of employers, jobs, or provide housing in the case of landlords. So I think that is going to be very important. To the degree that we can limit the areas in which the credit report is used, particularly those areas that are really important, like getting a student loan, getting having access to decent housing, and having access to a job. I think that would be a great first step. Other questions? Comments? Okay, you're very welcome, Representative Barber.
Camille, I have just one last question. I know we've getting close on time here, but if there was any other issues that, I know we asked you to pack a lot into those 20 minutes, but anything else you didn't touch on? One thing that came to mind for me was the gender pay gap and how that would have, sort of a disproportionate effect potentially on Black families or Black mothers. And if you could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. So that's true. I mean, with Black men, assuming that Black men and Black women form the majority of African-American partnerships, it's a big assumption, but like when you assume that, then if Black men are pretty much out of the workforce or not participating at levels that they need to because of the range of issues that we just talked about, then Black women are the ones really carrying the financial burden for families. And when you have a gender pay gap like we do here, which is about 56 cents to the dollar for Black men versus white men's wages for the same job, then you obviously can see how difficult it would be for Black women to make up the income and hence the wealth for their families.
Well, thank you so much, Camille. We really appreciate it. You're hanging around for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. And I can be reached at cbusett@brookings.edu. I'm sure Jennifer will circulate that. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And thank you again for joining us.
I'm just going to share my screen for one quick moment. So I want to shift gears just for a moment, folks, to help us think about what we've just learned and how that applies to early childhood. Camille did an excellent job of bringing this back to Jamal, helping us think about how this might affect families and parents. So as you're all alumni of the Early Childhood Fellows Program, you will recall that when we talk about supporting early learners, we don't just mean supporting them in early learning settings, so pre-K or childcare. So as this slide attempts to illustrate, those opportunities are just one piece of the puzzle. And this is by no means a complete list, but you'll likely also recall from your time in the Fellows Program that future educational achievement, just as Camille discussed, as well as lifelong health, is impacted by the conditions and the environments in which young children develop. And you will not have forgotten, of course, that nurturing and responsive caregiving by parents and other caregivers is sort of at the heart of healthy early childhood development, and that parental stress can have a harmful effect on parents' ability to provide that care, and which can then cause excessive stress response in kids, especially in the 0 to 5 age range. So with that sort of this framework of thinking about supporting early learners, I'd like to open it up to some group conversation. I think we've got a small enough group we can just sort of forego breakout rooms, but if you wouldn't mind, if you feel inclined to unmute yourself and think a little bit about, we've got some questions to help us bring this back to Jamal and think about how the issues and the policies that Camille discussed, how they might affect Jamal, how it might affect his performance in school, as we alluded to, and what you might take from Camille's presentation to your work in early childhood in your home states.
Well, this is Representative Billings. I'm especially interested in the issue of kids getting suspended from school. That's something that my main school district in my district is trying to work on. And I have 2 kids in their 20s, and I volunteered a lot in schools when they were young in our public schools. And so I think there's so much that's interrelated there. I remember seeing kids who, with instability of housing, ended up moving from place to place, and our school district they had trouble keeping kids in one school, when families would move and the kids would, and think about that stress. I always thought about that stress for kids of starting a new school and making new friends. And then I saw some kids that were just blossoming, and then all of a sudden the housing fell through, or whatever happened with families, and then they ended up getting pulled out of that school and going to the next school. And it and I wonder if that also has a piece to play with suspensions. The housing has something to play with the suspensions, as kids maybe have had trouble adjusting to new schools and making new friends, and breaking into those kind of cliques and groups. And I am very cognizant of the fact that if kids aren't in school, they can't learn. And I appreciate that as Camille said, in 2013, I think it was, the federal government, put some attention on that. And so I think that's about when my school system started paying attention to that too, and looking at our incredible disparity of numbers. But I think it's again, like most problems, it's not just a school district problem, it's a bigger problem, and school district problem clearly too. But I think a lot of our teachers saw those numbers and they were horrified. They thought, how can this be happening in our school district when we want, kids of color to do better, and we feel like we're focusing and trying to work on that, and look at what we're doing. I mean, it was a real wake-up call for us.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rick Billings. I don't know.
Billings, what comes to mind for me when you say that, Representative Billings, is that it also impairs the parents' ability to build the networks that Camille was talking about, because they're constantly being forced into a new community as well.
I appreciate that. And I guess what I've been thinking about, of course, over the last few months in general, are evictions and housing, and how COVID has exacerbated so much of that in my communities. I live in what is becoming a higher and higher housing cost community. And so many families who were able to make ends meet before COVID have been unable to pay the rent, given what's happened over the last 10 months. And there's been so much upheaval for families. And when a family is evicted, I mean, all of the stress and trauma of that effect on the child. So what was said about, starting a new school, but also having to uproot your life in a short period of time and not knowing where you're going. And while we've had some, moratoriums and legal assistance to stem that, there has still been a lot of so many challenges with keeping families just stable right now. And I think about how much that's impacting kids' learning, certainly.
This is Senator Petty, and it did cause me, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. It did cause me to think of a few things, particularly when it comes to housing, because so many times housing decisions are made not at the state level, but at the local level by local governments. So I think it does bring home how important community conversations are. I can think back, I was a teacher, I taught in a school district that was what now is very diverse, but at the time when I first started teaching was not. And a decision was made like to close a school so that there could be more diversity throughout the whole district and not just isolated at one school. And the acceptance of that, and that was like, that was about probably 20 years ago, but the acceptance of that was mixed. And I think that just speaks to how important it is to have community conversations about what does this do for everyone, and how important it can be. It does bring in that whole thing about is busing effective? And is it part sometimes of making decisions about that's tied to housing, but also maybe think about the availability of Section 8 vouchers and where they are accepted. And that is I think that's a continual issue. And as was mentioned earlier, the affordability, as we continue to, as cost of living continues to go up, then, and often lower income families don't have the luxury of being able to buy, so they're always in the rental market. That also can control what's available to them, where it's available to them. And so this becomes part of decisions about if new construction is going on, how much should be dedicated to controlled rent or for Section 8. And that's always a hard conversation.
Thanks for that, Senator Petty. I want to be conscious of time. I don't know, Camille, if you had any final thoughts related to the questions or issues that were brought up.
Just to say that, I appreciate your being so thoughtful about this, and already trying to think through what are some of the extensions of what we've been discussing here, and just encourage you to continue to do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks all for being willing to jump into a group conversation here. I want to hand things over to Shannon now. She's going to share some state examples that she's been tracking related to housing policies. So it's all yours, Shannon.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. All right, can everyone see what's on my screen? Yes, okay, so thank you, Jenny, and to Camille for providing the historical perspective for the landscape as it is today. So as Jenny mentioned, my name is Shannon Saul, and I'm a research analyst within CSL. I cover topic areas ranging from child support to family economic security and early childhood, obviously, but also to housing and homelessness. And so today I'm going to give you a rundown of the legislative landscape surrounding race and housing specifically. I'm going to be going over some of the recent legislation in this topic area, but feel free to drop any examples that you have that I don't mention in the chat box as well as I'm presenting. And following today's session, you're going to receive an email that will include a chart that I've compiled that has all recent legislation as well as state statutes that relate to race and housing. And that will include the bills that I'm going to talk about today. So don't feel like there's a need to take notes or memorize everything that I'm saying. So first, a bit about the legislative landscape over the past couple of years. So the bills I'm covering today are either still pending or they were enacted in 2020, though some of them were introduced in the 2019 legislative session. So in that document I mentioned that you'll receive following this session, you'll see that there are 15 state statutes included related to race and housing, as well as 10 bills that are not yet in statute. You'll also find in that chart that I have emboldened the parts of the text that are most relevant to what we have discussed today. So of the 10 bills that I have included, one was adopted, it's a resolution, and 8 bills are still pending in the legislature. And one bill that I included did fail, but I decided to include it anyways because it really closely relates to the topics that we've discussed today. And all of these statutes and bills came from 13 different states. So what's in these statutes and bills? There are some recurring themes, such as declaring racism as a public health crisis and directing the state's health department to treat it as such, eliminating discriminatory language in deeds and covenants that has remained from the era of redlining, collecting data related to race and housing to examine, for example, how segregated neighborhoods are, or the difference in wealth and homeownership between races, and studying the effects of historical racism and how it affects the lives of constituents today. So the first bill I'm going to talk about was passed in 2020 and is now a part of the Virginia State Code. I've included some of the direct language of these bills on these slides. So what you see in bullets is mostly directly from the text and not my wording. So this bill specifically created a commission to study slavery and what it calls subsequent state-sanctioned racial and economic discrimination. This commission is also tasked with studying the current impact and long-term inequities caused by slavery and what it calls pervasive institutional inequities in housing, employment, economic opportunities, generational wealth, voting rights, and criminal justice. So those are the topic areas that it mentions specifically. This next bill is still pending in the Nebraska legislature. It is a resolution to study issues related to redlining, specifically within Nebraska municipalities. So the text of the bill dictates that the study is to include the negative impacts of redlining on racial and socioeconomic segregation, the legal underpinnings of redlining, including the role of federal, state, and local governments in promoting it, and potential policy solutions to reverse the negative impacts of redlining. So as Camille discussed, redlining is still leaving impacts on our communities today. And so this bill is one that specifically targets that. This next bill was introduced in Illinois in 2019, but was enacted in 2020 and is now a part of state statute. And it amends the Illinois State Human Rights Act and makes it a civil rights violation for an owner or any person engaging in a real estate transaction to discriminate, alter the terms and conditions of, or refuse to engage in a transaction because of an arrest record. So this bill obviously doesn't specifically target any racial group or study any specific racial group like some of the other ones I've mentioned, but I included it because, as we've discussed, an arrest record is a barrier that people of color may be more likely to face than others when attempting to find housing. And this bill aims to prevent that discrimination. So this final bill that I'll be sharing with you all today is currently pending in the Arizona Senate. It is a resolution that proclaims that racism is a public health crisis. This is a type of bill that other states have recently introduced as well, and you'll find those in the resource document I mentioned that you'll receive after this session. So this bill specifically declares that the legislature commits to working to create equity and justice-oriented governance, and that they will develop a work plan for educational efforts to address and dismantle racism. So the bill states that that work plan should include ways to expand state personnel's understanding of racism and how it affects both individual and population health, as well as providing tools to assist personnel in engaging actively and authentically with communities of color. And again, all of this wording is directly from the bill, not my own. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about legislation related to housing and homelessness, I'm going to go ahead and plug NCSL's great resource on that for you all. So this is our housing and homelessness legislation database. A link will be dropped in the chat momentarily from Allison. And you'll also find the link to this in the email that you get after this session. So this database tracks all introduced legislation that relates to housing and homelessness. It's updated at least weekly, though sometimes more often. And it's searchable by year, keyword, topic, and bill status. So again, this is all introduced legislation, including failed and pending legislation. On the left here, you'll see I've circled on the webpage where you'll find additional resources, as well as direct links to contact myself and my colleague, Sarah Scherer. We are the ones who maintain this database and cover housing and homelessness for NCSL. So when you open this database, you will find that you can select certain topics and states to filter through, or you can enter words in the keyword search. You can also choose if you want to look at only active legislation for a certain year, or if you only want to look at enacted legislation, you can sort by status. And you can also search by bill number and author here if you know more specifically what you're looking for. We also define each of these filter topics below on this webpage. So if you're unsure what we mean by a certain category, you can find that information there. So thank you all for listening for what I had to share. And here's my contact information. Will also be distributed after this session. But I am also available for questions and also any discussion that you all have based on what I shared.
Thanks, Shannon. I wondered if anyone had examples to share from their own states. If Barbara mentioned the conversations in Massachusetts, if any of these bills ring a bell or are happening in your states, or something different that might be coming up this 2021 legislative session. Feel free to unmute and chime in.
You know, Camille's presentation was, for me, was wonderful, and she highlighted some of the bridges, as I mentioned, that still exist. I have the Southern State, which was built to prevent buses to go to the beach in one of our neighborhood towns. So I have several of those bridges that are built. But in Long Island, we have some of the highest number of segregated communities in all of America. And so just thinking about some of the legislative policies we've implemented recently. Our local paper did a whole expose about how realtors, you know, in this day and age, were actively steering certain individuals into certain neighborhoods. So if you were Black, they didn't take you to a white neighborhood, they steered you to a Black neighborhood. And they have video recording of it, you know, audio of it, of this happening. So recently the legislature enacted several bills to make sure that, you know, real estate agents, if they are caught doing this, there's fines, fees, they lose their realtor's license. And, you know, we're looking into seeing how we can further implement rules and policy to ensure that we can kind of desegregate some of these communities. But it's, you know, disappointing that this day and age this is happening.
Thanks for sharing that, Assemblywoman Slash. Go ahead, Camille.
Thank you.
I just have a quick follow-up question about that, Assemblywoman. How is that, like, how are those realtors kind of like brought to light? Is that, you know, just someone working with them that kind of reports them, or I'm just kind of curious more about how that system works.
So it would work where, so if an individual felt that they've been discriminated against, there's actually a state hotline that we implemented that someone could call and report that realtor. And some of the bills that are pending is that if if a realtor is doing this, the realtor company can actually be sanctioned as well.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
One of the other ways we're looking at it in Massachusetts is, I don't believe this is the case in every state, but all of our, as was mentioned by someone else, all of our zoning decisions are really done, almost all of them are done at the local level. So we end up with, 390 cities and towns making their own decisions about housing, and historically, many communities, particularly in the suburbs, have kept a lot of people out of their communities, and that's been, by design through their zoning. So there's been a bigger push recently at the state level to try to make zoning changes, but it is certainly met with strong opposition from local communities who often, are citing their ability to make these decisions, that make sense for their communities, as they would say. But it is something that we're kind of, I think, trying to chip away at in the state, but a big challenge for us to, at the state level, work on some of these issues that really are right now in the hands of the local decision makers.
That's a really good point, Rep. Barber. I'm sort of dawning on me that if you didn't happen to have an expose in the newspaper, or all this is being handled at the local level, I'm wondering sort of how states go about understanding the magnitude of this issue within their own state. We talked about the importance of the data collection when it comes to suspensions, but if these sort of issues are happening and they're happening at the local level, I guess if anyone has examples from their own state, or if Camille, sort of how, if you're new to this topic, how you go about sort of understanding the issue within your own state.
I wanted to give others a chance to speak up. One thing I would say, so I've been following for a number of years things that have been happening in San Francisco, California, which is, not like every other jurisdiction in the country, but has certainly been, I think, thoughtful and methodical about how to study and gather input from communities on the impact of discrimination across the city. They have an Office of Financial Justice in San Francisco, which is really doing very interesting work that I think actually could be elevated to the state level if in a different state, because I think California already has some mechanisms in place that are very similar. But if you wanted to take a look at some interesting things and the way in which they've done that, the sort of rubrics that they're using. So the city and county of San Francisco, their Office of Financial Justice is a great place to start just as a reference point.
That's excellent. Thank you. Any other last questions? We're about at time. If you've got any burning questions for Camille or Shannon? Hearing none, thank you so much to Camille and Shannon for your time and expertise. Again, we'll be sending along some resources from both of them for some reading afterwards. I want to also thank our very generous sponsor of this series, the Buffett Early Childhood Fund, for helping us bring this 5-part series to you all. We would love to get your feedback on how today went. So Allison's going to drop a link in the chat for the Survey Monkey. I know that these things, we're always asking you to do these, and these are kind of a pain. So we would like to reward you by buying you a cup of coffee this time around. We've got some gift cards to buy you your favorite hot beverage. If you take just a minute or two to complete this survey, we really appreciate it. Our funders, our bosses really appreciate being able to know how we did today. Mark your calendars, everyone, for March 12th will be part 4 in our series, where we'll be looking at early childhood education through the race equity lens. If you have any questions at all about what you learned today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and my NCSL colleagues. We will follow up with Camille's contact information as well. We are all here to serve you and help you, do the best you can. So with that, please enjoy the rest of your day. Please, please, please take the survey. Let us buy you a drink, a caffeinated beverage. And thank you so much and be well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jennifer, and everybody at NCSL.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.